thank you for being here. This is, if you didn't know, we'll get you another glass of wine, but this is the 2017 A Night with Authors, a signature literary Lubbock event. We're so glad that you could join us. I, like you, am a reader and lover of books. And I want to welcome you to our Temple of Books, the library at Texas Tech University. And I also want to remind you that this event tonight kicks off the Lubbock Book Festival, which will continue tomorrow all day long at the Louise Hopkins Underwood Center for the Arts campus. It's scattered around on the buildings. Starts pretty early in the morning, doesn't it, Gene? 9:30, that's early for we musicians, and goes till 9:30 at night. That's more to our taste. 9:30 at night. I do want to remind you that we have a silent auction going on, and once we get going, please go over there, place your bids. The silent auction will end fairly soon, and so you need to make sure you get your bid in. But I want to, before we get too far, I want to remember that we can't do this without a lot of help. Our sponsors, you'll find names listed on our program, and the Friends of the Library. These folks are indispensable to us to make this event happen. So I would like for you right now to please reward that with some applause, and I would like when you see these folks throughout the evening to pat them on the back and tell them in person how much you appreciate that. So, thank you. And speaking of appreciation, our first speaker tonight merits all of the appreciation that we can muster. He's former Lubbock mayor, president of one of our city's top insurance agencies, firms, past president of the Texas Tech Alumni Association's National Board of Directors, and a current member of the Board of Directors of the Texas Tech Foundation, and he and his entire family are Red Raiders through and through. But what's really cool is that he's the only person that I know, my friend, any of my friends, who has a lake named after him. I don't know how you do that, but what a deal. So please, another warm applause for our honorary chair, Alan Henry.
Andy, thank you very much. It's a real pleasure to be here. Sandy was looking on the program and said, that's obviously a misprint. They've got you as the honorary chairman. And I said, yeah, it is a misprint, but let's just play it through and see what happens. It is a real honor to be here and to tell you a little bit about the purpose of the funds that are being raised for Literary Lubbock. And it's a great pleasure for me because the honor goes to Grover E. Murray. Of course, many of us knew Dr. Murray, and Sally, where is Sally? There's Sally. Sally, we thank you so very much for all that you continue to do. But let me tell you a little bit about Grover Murray. I don't know how many of you actually knew Grover personally. This will show a little bit about our age, but Sandy and I met Grover Murray when we were working for Congressman Mahon in 1966, I think it was. And Sandy was 4, and I was leading her around by her hand, but I was of age, I have to tell you. But the book series that is published by the Texas Tech University Press is devoted to all aspects of culture, history, natural history, and the sciences as they serve to define the Southwest and to engage and enlighten its broadest constituency. Grover E. Murray, 1916 to 2003. It's hard to believe he's been gone that long. He He was so important here for so long. Geologist and 8th president of Texas Tech, was born in Mahon, North Carolina. Those of you who knew Dr. Murray, I'll just, show of hands, how many knew Dr. Murray? There are so many of you here. You know, one of my favorite descriptions of Congressman Mahon, and Chancellor Hance is here, and he will talk about him, is he was a gentleman. Well, so was Grover Murray. Grover Murray was born in Mahon, North Carolina. He was a gentleman. He was someone who you respected when you talked with him, and you knew that he was listening when you were talking. He earned a B.S. in geology and a doctorate from Louisiana State University, where he would eventually serve as vice president for academic affairs before the Texas High Plains would entice him to preside over Texas Technological College. He was here at a very, very important time because he was inaugurated November 1st, 1966, and immediately began to push for the college's expansion. In his decade-long administration, he oversaw transition from college to university, implemented construction of 17 new buildings and a museum, and acquired $130 million to build new law and medical schools. Now that's quite a record. Yet Dr. Murray never lost sight of his first loves. He worked as a geologist consultant for more than 4 decades and carried out and supported significant research throughout the world, including Antarctica, where an ice-covered peninsula in the Amundsen Sea is named Murray Foreland in his honor. His visionary plan for studying dry climates and their physiological effects developed into the International Center for Arid and Semi-Arid Land Studies. And I remember the first time that I heard Dr. Murray say icasols, and we you know, it's one of those things you say, yeah, right, whatever you say. But he made it work, and we're so grateful that he did. Those programs and research have reached every continent. President Murray's lifelong passionate interest in all aspects of the American Southwest, scientific, historical, and cultural, is reflected in the scope and liveliness of the book series named in his honor. And we will be hearing about several of those in just a little while. But this is fascinating. I'm not going to read all of these, but here are some of the titles of the books in the series honoring Dr. Murray. Cowboy Park, Stair Roping Contests on the Border by John Baxter. Cacti of Texas, a field guide. Now this is one of our honorees tonight is Paul Carlson. Paul Carlson wrote Dancin' and Anson, A History of the Texas Cowboys Christmas Ball. Now that's one I would love to read, Dr. Carlson. Kit Carson and the First Battle of Adobe Walls. Kent, did you know there was more than one? Okay, well, this was the first one in case you missed it. Javelinas, collared peccaries in the Southwest. And pecans, the story in a nutshell. And Texas quilts and quilters, and everyone's favorite, the Wineslinger Chronicles, Texas on the Vine. So you can tell what a fascinating group of books that these are about the Southwest, and you can see why it is so important that the publishing of these very important books be continued through your generosity. And we appreciate so much your being here, and we're looking forward to the program, and thank you so much.
Thank you, Alan. And please enjoy your salads, but not so much you don't put a bid in on the silent auction. And we'll get back to the program in just a few minutes. Thank you. All right. I hope there are a lot of bids up there at the silent auction. The main course will be here shortly, but not so shortly that we don't get to hear a couple of really good talks. And the first talk will be one of my favorite talkers. I didn't say that right, did I? I meant speaker, and what I really mean is storyteller, but I'll talk about that. Lawyer, law professor, state senator, United States congressman, Texas Tech graduate, chancellor emeritus. Please help me welcome the best storyteller ever to emerge from Dimmitt, Texas, and maybe from the whole state, Kent Hance.
He told me to take my time. Susie, when I got up, said, don't go too long. There's always conflicts in life, always conflict. You know, we're glad to be here, and Mayor Henry, my insurance man that I call when I have a problem, and he always solves my problem, and I appreciate that. Jim Bruns, one of the wisest persons I've ever known. He was a CFO when I was chancellor. One time he told me, this like in the first week or so, he said, remember this, if you don't want to do something, there's never enough money. He said, but if you want to do something, there'll be enough money. I said, that's the kind of guy I want. He understands the process, and gave a lot of dedicated service, Monty Monroe and, the Southwest Collection and so many friends here that it's, and he said I was a storyteller from Dimmitt to the best in Dimmitt. That's probably a low bar. But, I will say this. I was campaigning for Congress, and I went in the pool hall in Dimmitt, and there were 3 guys playing dominoes. Mitzi can back me up on this because Mitzi's originally from Dimmitt too. And there were 3 guys playing Moon. You know, if you've got 4, you can play 42 or regular dominoes. With 3, you play Moon. And there was a dog sitting in a chair, just sitting there. And I asked this friend of mine, I said, Billy's that dog playing dominoes too? And he said, he can, but he's not any good. And I said, I said, why? And he said, when he gets a good hand, he starts wagging his tail. I always liked that. Sam Gwynn, you ought to write a book about that dog. And they had one other story. Andy told me to kind of warm up the crowd. Janet, we'll get to the book in a moment. But there was a guy, and Mitzi, his name is Big John Johnson. And one day he went into the sheriff's office and said, there's a man out at the farm in my closet. And he said, get your gun. And he got his, what would have been known as a SWAT team now. He got, Jack Cartwright got one of his deputies. And they went out with the shotgun, and the guy drew him a map of where the man was hiding in the closet. And he stayed outside, and they went in with their guns ready. And they got in there, and they were gone about 10 minutes, and they came back. And the sheriff said, Big John, what did that old boy have on? He said he had on boots like mine and Levi's like mine. And he said, well, let me tell you, he's changed clothes. He's got on shoes and slacks like mine. And he said, what? He said, it's a mirror. And what had happened? His wife had cleaned the closet and put a mirror in the closet. And Big John said, Jack, whatever you do, don't tell anybody. And Sheriff Jack Cartwright turned on the lights and siren to get back to town to tell him. Until the day he left to move to California, people to see him in town, they said, what's that old boy wearing today? Did he dress like you one more time? Janet's book on George Mahon is excellent. Janet's been here and is this is the fifth book that you've worked on and written. It's been with the Southwest Collection and has done an excellent job. This book, if you don't like politics, and some people don't, they won't like it. If you like politics, you're going to love the book. And it goes into detail. And George Mahon did something that I could never have done. Neugebauer, Combest, Jody Arrington. He took a trip one time to Japan and the Philippines with 30-some-odd congressmen, or a good number, 20 or 30, and they ride a train from Washington, D.C. to Seattle and then go by boat to Japan and the Philippines. They were going a month. Do you think you could get reelected to be gone a month? People would just beat the thunder out of you. You know, he's wasting our money, he's no good. And he set up some additional trade agreements that were later implemented, had to do with cotton. And so he met a lot of people. And the other thing, I took a few trips. I took one to Canada, took one to Nicaragua, and took one to the Middle East, and took one to China. The one I took to China was a trip that we met with Deng Xiaoping, and you get to know the other members if you go on a trip with them. And you know, one thing I think about Congressman, we had a prayer group that met on every other Thursday, and I never saw somebody get up and really go after somebody that's in that same group. You know, they just didn't do it. Now, in this day and time, members are trying to get other members indicted. You know, I mean, they don't just disagree. They're trying to figure out, how do we get this person indicted? How do we destroy their career? How do we destroy their life? And it's difficult. You just think it's a gridlock, and that it's so different from what George saw, and Congressman was working on the Manhattan Project. And the Manhattan Project had to do with the development of the atomic bomb. It was very important. But a few members of the press found out about it, and they didn't start writing about it. You think that would happen today? No one would withhold that this is so important for the country. We'll write a book, but we won't do anything about it until after the project's over. And Mahon was the chairman. He was in a position with that group of people that they would take different trips. They took many trips to Oak Ridge, Tennessee. You know, they took trips to Los Alamos. They took trip to White Sands. And they would have to come up with different reasons, and the staff didn't, they kept it secret. And I just think it would be an impossibility in this day and time. When you have networks, when you have MSNBC, CNN, Fox, CNBC, they're 24/7. They've got to come up with something. And it's difficult. It's difficult. And now more people get their information from the blogs, from social media, than they do from newspapers and TV, and that's difficult. But this book really points out the stability of some unusual times, but how they got along together. I want to mention one other thing. When I was in Congress, I helped Ronald Reagan, and we got to be friends. He took me to Camp David one weekend, and Phil Graham called me the next. He said, what are you doing going to Camp David? And you took some congressmen with me. I said, they were undecided on the tax cut, and you were already committed. He said, hell, I'll never commit to you early again. But Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill, they disagreed and everything, but they were always gentlemen. They were gentlemen. and they were not trying to get each other indicted or crucified. And this book gives you a different time, and I don't know what the answer will be at some point in time within society. But I thought it was an excellent book, and it talked about the procedures. It was technically, Janet, very sound, very sound. You did a lot of research on that book, and you spent a lot of time on it. And it was and it didn't get into the day-to-day campaigns, but George Mahon was a great campaigner, and it had changed on him. The next time he had a big race was in '76. And so from the 30s, it changed dramatically. And even at that, he could tell that he didn't want any part of that. And that served as chairman of appropriations for 14 years. I said in the book, his conscience was, he was a statesman and a gentleman. Had he had LBJ's conscience, NASA would have been in Lubbock. It would have. The CIA would have been in Lubbock. You know, a National Research Center would have all been in Lubbock. But Mahon never took advantage of anyone. And they're just, you know, there's few in this day and time. And but it's an excellent book. I was glad to do the foreword. And I read the manuscripts, read every page. And Susie heard at least 80% of the book. She said, I'm going to read the book. When it comes out, I'm going to read the book. I said, well, just listen to this. And I did that on Sam Gwynn's book to her also. And but it was excellent. And Janet, we're very proud of you. This was a labor of love for you. And it was obvious, anyone that reads the book. Be sure and get a copy. And there are also, if you've got friends that like politics, great gift for Christmas. Janet, thank you very much for allowing me to participate in the excellent book. And thank you so much. And now we want to hear from you. And I apologize for taking a little more of my time, but you need to hear that Big John Johnson story.
One afternoon, the phone in my office rang, and it was Dr. Lawrence Draves. And after we exchanged pleasantries, he asked if I would finish his Mahon biography. He said that his health had become so fragile. Can you hear me better now? Okay, good. I'll get rid of that one. He said that his health had become so fragile that he didn't believe he could finish it. Well, I thought, I don't know if I can finish it. Anyway, we talked for a while, and I said, I'll do this if you will guide me and oversee what I do. Oh, yes, I'll do that. Well, unfortunately, about 5 weeks later, he died, and I was on my own after that. We had gotten into our office, or I had his notes and the pages he had written, and he started out writing not only about the appropriations, but about Mahon's efforts in agriculture. And I felt like that was just going to be way more than I could handle and way more than one book needed. So I started over, and I kept his first chapter and went on from there. And after I had devised the plan of attack, I met Nelda Thompson, who at that time was chair, I guess she was executive director of the CH Foundation. And she said, oh, I'm so happy to know that someone has taken his project. And I want you to apply for funds from the foundation to hire someone to work in your place half-time while you do the research. She said, when I was a young woman, he asked me to work in his congressional office, and I've always wondered what my life would have been like if I had taken him up on that. But she was teaching at Tech, and she liked it. So the CH Foundation did fund the proposal, and I have been eternally grateful, not only for the money, but for the support and encouragement that they have given me. Mahon was elected to Congress in 1935, and in 1939 he went onto the Appropriations Committee with the help of Sam Rayburn. He initially wanted to serve on the Agricultural Subcommittee. The Appropriations Committee was the largest one in Congress, and it was divided at that time into 10 subcommittees to fund each of the executive agencies. But the Agricultural Committee was full. So he served for a few years on a minor committee. It was a DC committee that nobody wants, but everybody has to serve on. And the chair of the a full chair of the Appropriations Committee approached him one day and said, I want you to serve on the War Department subcommittee. At that time, the Army and Air Force were funded by the War Department, and the Navy subcommittee funded the Navy. The military was not united. And he said, well, I've never served in the military. I don't know anything about it. Can I have a day to think it over? Yes. So he raced to find Sam Rayburn and said, I don't know what to do about this. And Rayburn said, take it and take it fast. The war clouds are building in Europe, and if we get pulled into that conflict, this will become the most important committee in Congress. And so he went back and he took it. Well, we did get pulled into World War II. Then we drifted into the Cold War for 40 years. So for about 45 years or a little longer, this nation was battle ready at all times. And that was the most important committee in Congress. There were some years that the appropriations that came out of that committee used more than half of the federal budget. And when Mahon retired many years later, he was still telling people, service on that committee made all the difference in the world in my career. Mahon decided, I was going to talk about the presidents. He worked closely with every president because they needed to get their budget funded for defense. And they became friends with him. And the book is full of little stories about how each of the presidents tried to befriend him. But one of the ones that I've got the biggest kick out of is one that Helen Mahon told after he died. President Eisenhower liked to play golf with Mahon. And it was easy to understand why. Mahon was a pretty good golfer. He was a perfect gentleman. He was a hard worker. And when foreign dignitaries were in town or were visiting, he was the kind of congressman he wanted to introduce to people. So when he wanted to play golf with Mahon, an aide would call Mahon and say, Mr. Green has died. What time can you get away for the funeral? And that became their tee-off time. Mahon would go, he'd drive down to the White House, get in the car with Eisenhower, and they'd drive out to Burning Tree Country Club to play golf. And there are many stories like that about how other presidents, and especially LBJ, about how he worked with Mahon to get Mahon to support both the Great Society and the Vietnam War at the same time. Mahon decided to retire in 1977. He felt like at the end of the term in 1978, he would be 80 years old and that he was just ready to retire. Many things were changing in Congress, and the district was becoming Republican, and he would have had a hard time winning an election. Letters poured into the office from former presidents, colleagues, everyone, and they all had the same general theme. Your work has been superior. We understand your need to rest and your want to rest, but it's going to be mighty hard to replace you. But the one that appealed to me most was a column in the Washington Post by George Will. He said that Mahon, when Mahon came to Congress, he helped the nation. And that was good for the nation. And he said when he retired 44 years later, he was as good as the day that he came. And he described Mahon as being tall and lean and looking like he'd been whittled from a West Texas fence post by the wind. Mahon died in 1985. And I've heard people say, it's a shame, the younger generation won't know him. They won't know what he did. Many people won't know him because they'll forget about him. But I believe if you will read A Witness to History, you'll know George Mahon even better than many of his contemporaries knew him. Because when he would come to the district to visit, he talked with people all the time, but the conversation was always about the other person. It was never about him. And he never did really tell what he did. He didn't tell about the important committees he served on and things like that. So I think that the readers will know him better than others did. And I hope that each of you, or many of you, will buy the book and will enjoy the chance to get to know George Mahon. Thank you.
Thank you, Janet. And this is a good time to remind you that the silent auction is still open, but will only be open until 7:25. And also to remind you, and we'll talk about it later, that these books are for sale here tonight, in case you hadn't figured that out. And you have the authors here who can sign them for you. Thank you, Janet. Thank you, Chancellor Hance. Your food has arrived. The great job that David Deason and his people do at Top Tier Catering. You're going to enjoy it. We'll be back in a little bit. All right. So I hope you got your bids in, because the silent auction is no longer an auction, and I guess it's not even silent. It's over with. So I hope you got your name in with your amount of money, and you'll get that prize that you sought. And I don't know about you, but I really enjoyed my steak. And speaking of steak and meat, I've got to tell you that some quarter of a century back, you know, at my age, quarter of a century rolls off my tongue a lot easier than it used to. Quarter of a century back, I met our next author at a chili cook-off where he was stirring up a pot of basic Texas red. That's a phrase for a particular kind of chili. But I already knew his writing before I'd ever sampled his version of the national food of Texas. He'd crafted a delightful story in the Avalanche Journal about Lank Spangler, a fictional West Texas musician. It's such a great story that since that time, Lank Spangler and I have become very close friends. And the author of that piece, and Lank, we have been those good pals. The author, Bob Horton, has been in journalism for over 50 years, writing for newspapers, magazines, and hosting radio programs, all the while doing award-winning work, which includes, and this is a big deal, a Pulitzer Prize nomination for his coverage of the Pentagon during the Vietnam War. His book of Bulletins and Booze, A Newsman's Story of Recovery, relates many of the unforgettable moments that Horton experienced during his career in the fast-paced world of professional journalism. He lives here in Lubbock. Please welcome Bob Horton.
You better plug. It's about plugging my book, of course. I'm Bob Horton. I'm glad to be here. Thank you, Andy. I did meet. I'd done my math too. It was 25 years ago. I met Andy at a chili cook-off. Actually, his dad was part of a chili club, which I helped organize here, and we went around the country cooking chili and staying out of mischief as best we could. Glad to see Ken Hance here too. I covered Congress for about 3 years while I was in Washington. I think Kent was on the House with the Ways and Means Committee, Science and Technology, and I covered dozens and dozens of those hearings over the years. And I would look for a Texas nameplate up there, keep up with who the Texans who were in Washington on the committees, and Kent was one of them. I tell you, there was a veteran reporter Kent may know him. Charlie Cordry worked for United Press International, which was a competitor of mine as I was with the AP. And Charlie later worked for the Baltimore Sun. Charlie told me one time, if you want to get your story in the paper, you go to one of these hearings, go to a press conference, just listen for the most outrageous thing there is and lead with that. I thought about that. Well, I don't think you said anything outrageous that day, Kent, and I didn't write anything outrageous, so we didn't get in the paper the next day, you know? That's the way it is in the news business, kind of sensationalized a lot. But it was a vocation I believed in deeply. I believe it's vital to this country. We have to have a free press. You can't have a licensed press. The government will run it. So get my little political view in there. Give me a cheat sheet out here if I brought it. I want to thank Literary Lubbock for this opportunity to talk about my book and be in company of some fine authors too, Eugenio, and I'm sorry Nancy's not here. I wanted to talk to her and read about her book. I never intended to write a memoir, but I was I was one of hundreds of reporters who come and go out of Washington, and you know, what's the point? You know, it'd be an ego trip and all that stuff. But one day, my son, youngest son, I have two sons. They still live up in the Washington area. One in Maryland, one in Virginia. Dad, he looked at his resume and he saw that I worked for AP, and I worked for Reuters later on. I worked for U.S. News and World Report magazine. I even started a news service for AARP before I was even qualified to belong to the outfit. And Dad, we didn't know you did all these things. Why don't you write some of that down? Well, I got to thinking about it. I knew he didn't need an extended resume, titles and dates and places. I will write some of my experiences. Well, who wants to publish this doggone thing? Well, okay, I'm a Tech alumni. Maybe that will give me an entree. So I made a proposal to the editor of Tech Press, who at that time was Judith Keeling. And she read my first few chapters and wrote back that, well, this is very, very well written, and it's very nice, interesting reading for your family and relatives and friends. But we need some story here, some crisis met, some challenge confronted, something overcome or not overcome. Make it a little, you got to have some drama here. And I said, drinking? And she said, yes. And I thought, me and my big mouth. Now I've got to write about something I never wanted to write about, something that didn't reflect on my sterling image, you know, that I thought I had. I didn't want to write about that, but on the other hand, if I'm going to write an honest story of my life and give it to my sons, which that was the whole point, really, I'm going to open up, and they're going to learn things that they didn't know, and it would be good for me to do it. And it was good. It was therapeutic, and I wrote about it. I'm not going to dwell on the alcoholic part right now, but that cast a shadow over my career in later years. I never got fired for drinking. I should have been. But it really bled me of enthusiasm for my work. It caused strife in the family. It caused all these consequences that some of you may know well about if you have friends or relatives who are alcoholics or addicts. The consequences are far-reaching beyond the individual involved. So I started my little memoir. I grew up in Terry County on a farm out here near a little town, Meta. Went to Meta High School. Which lets me talk about George Mahon. When I was in Washington, I was covering the Pentagon about the second year I got there, and at the start of the Vietnam War, the real heated, ugly, bloody, decisive war that still has repercussions today. But I wanted to meet George Mahon because he was head of the House Appropriations Committee. He had a House Defense Appropriations Subcommittee, and it was good that I get to know him. And so I went over and met him, and he said, well, now, where do you live? And I said, well, I grew up between Lubbock and Brownfield. Well, where? Well, I grew up on a farm north of a little town called Meta. Yeah, I don't know where Meta is. where? Which side of the highway? I said, well, my granddad Horton's farm is on the west side of the highway, 2 miles north of Meta. He said, oh, you must know the Burlesons. I mean, he knew this district like the back of his hand. He knew the Burleson family that lived down the road from us, you know. They raised money for him at some point in his campaigns, I'm sure. Anyway, I got my start in the news business as a freshman in college in Big Spring, Texas. I'd gone down there to Howard County Junior College on a basketball scholarship. It was a hot-shot little school, you know, player, and had a scholarship, paid my books, tuition fees, and so forth. But I got married the first semester I was down there, and I needed to get a job because my parents did provide an apartment for me and my wife, $57.50 a month for an upstairs garage apartment. Natural gas bill for the stove was $2.50 a month. And of course, some of you remember the gasoline wars. Gasoline was 21, 22 cents a gallon, sometimes cheaper than that. So I could go to work somewhere and make a little money, and the Big Spring Daily Herald hired me as a part-time worker. Good people, man. The editor there, Joe Pickle, his brother was Congressman in Washington, Jake Pickle. Good folks. They took care of me. They put me on, just created a job, and I got to start. One of the first things I did, I worked with a sports editor. First thing, I typed up bowling results. Now, that takes a lot of creativity. Then he got me into high school sports. Now, I'm not talking covering the Big Spring Steers of high school, nor the junior varsity. I went out and interviewed the coach of the 5th grade team. Coach, what kind of prospects you got this year? Who's your best player? That quarterback coming along pretty good, you know. Good. I really threw my enthusiasm into it, and that was good. 2 years later, finished up down there, transferred to Tech. I hadn't even had a journalism degree, so I'm in the journalism department as they had then. Now it's the College of Mass Communications. Wonderful. Went to work at the Avalanche Journal, walked in on Charlie Guy, the editor there. Charlie had been editor of the Avalanche Journal about the time God invented dirt. I mean, he was a good guy. And he was back there typing on his column in the corner, and turned around, he paid attention to my introduction, told him I'd come up and needed a job working at Tech. Called Jay Harris, he's a night managing editor. Called Jay Harris, put me on the payroll. Burrow Pettit, who came there, Burrow was a sports writer when I came there, 1959, and later became my editor when I came back from Washington. Burrow said I was the only reporter Charlie Guy ever hired directly. I'm not sure, that may be a little exaggeration, but I did walk in on Charlie Guy and ask for the job and got it. So after 2 years, a fortuitous circumstance led me to go to work for the Associated Press in Tennessee. University of Tennessee is there, later to Knoxville, where the university is. So I got to cover a lot of stuff, sports and busting up moonshine stills. And 3 years later, I wind up in Dallas, Texas, January 1964. I wanted to get back to Texas. This is a pivotal moment in my career because 6 weeks earlier, John F. Kennedy had been assassinated in Dallas. There's plenty of post-assassination news to write about, and I was involved in it. The most important thing was that late in 1964 came the trial of Jack Ruby, the Dallas nightclub owner who shot Lee Harvey Oswald, the purported assassin of President Kennedy, and hundreds of news people came from around the world to cover that trial, much bigger than O.J. Simpson's trial. The AP formed a special reporter team. 4 bigwigs from New York came down. 3 or 4 people from the Dallas Bureau, including me, joined them to cover the trial. I didn't cover the main testimony. I wrote what we call sidebars. I interviewed prospective jurors as they came out, the lawyers who, when they had breaks in the testimony, so forth. The stories that I wrote and the others wrote went directly to New York, bypassing the usual relay points and regional bureaus, so that New York could get it out to the world quickly. And therefore, stuff that I wrote with my byline was seen by some important people in New York. and I'm theorizing this, but it has to be true, otherwise they wouldn't know who the heck Bob Horton was. And when an opening came up in Washington, they offered it to me. I didn't spend 5 minutes saying yes, you know. That's the best news reporting place in the world, in my opinion. I mean, I don't know where else would a reporter want to go. And so I went, and I was there nearly 25 years. As my son will learn later in the book, or did learn later, I worked for the Associated Press in the early years, covering the Vietnam War. Took a break for a while. Reuters, I got on with Reuters, the British wire service. Reuters was not a direct competitor of AP. They came to the United States to report on economic news. They were big in London. In fact, they started getting an edge over their competitors in London by using carrier pigeons to fly the stock reports across town so they can get it out faster than the other guys using bicycles and motorcycles. They come to this country to get American economic news. American news, of course, affects the rest of the world. But in addition to trying to service banks and investment houses and this and that, they had to have general news coverage because virtually anything that takes place in Washington has an economic impact. That's why Reuters was there. That's why they needed me, a general reporter. I didn't know anything about the stock market, really. I'd lost enough money in it not to know, be aware of that. But so I went to work for Reuters. Good folks, they just worked at a different pace. They didn't rush it out like AP and UPI did. They could lay back and give a little thought to it and give a little background to it, a little perspective. So I enjoyed that part of it and covered some big stuff. I covered Congress for 3 years, State Department 3 or 4 years, traveled around the country and around the world with secretaries of defense, secretaries of state. I was not the main White House guy, but I spent a lot of time covering the White House, traveling with presidents. Jimmy Carter, when he was on his campaign effort toward the end, I traveled with him. And Ronald Reagan, he was not president when I covered him. He was president-elect. Well, when you have a guy who's going to be president, the whole press gravitates toward him. The other guy's a lame duck. So I went with the Reagans out to California for a week or so, went to church at Beverly Hills with them. Touch me, you know. I don't think I got a story out of it, and I didn't need to. It was a nice thing to go to. I was the White House Pooh reporter for that. They also had a bash in Palm Springs that I was there. I was not allowed inside like I would like to have been, but I stood outside and watched people like Frank Sinatra come in, Lucille Ball, Danny Kaye. I mean, just scores of them coming to pay tribute to Ronald. Ronald Reagan was the target of an assassination attempt. I was nearly there. That's my little brush with history. He was shot at the Washington Hilton, outside the Washington Hilton, broad daylight. I had been there an hour earlier across the street at a foreign embassy's attaché office to get a visa renewed or something for a trip overseas, and I left and went back to the State Department just in time to hear on the news that Ronald Reagan had been shot. We didn't know, well, we knew he'd been shot at, didn't know whether he was even hit until later. But if I'd been around an hour longer, I could have been in one of the big story breaks of the year, but that's the way it goes. That's the way it is in the news business. You just have to be in the right place at the right time. The alcohol bit, I drank as a kid in West Texas. It was bootleg liquor in those days. We knew where the bootleggers were. When I went to work for the Avalanche Journal, we had a guy on the desk who'd call a bootlegger after midnight when the work was done, deliver a fifth of whiskey, and we'd drink a little whiskey in the AJ newsroom. It wouldn't happen again today. So I was in the habit of drinking. Jay Harris, who was eventually editor today, they would come over to my apartment, and we would have late-hour drinking sessions, 2 in the morning, and I had to go to tech the next day at 7 and 8. Don't know how I did it, but I did it. And so that habit went with me to Washington, except when I got to Washington, I was very insecure about my qualifications for being there, and rightly so. What have I done in Lubbock, Texas? Covered Farm Bureau beauty contests, car wrecks, 7-Eleven robberies, Friday Night Lights activities. Now I'm up here in a whole different level, wars, politics, scandals, assassination deals. Good gosh. I was ambitious, had some West Texas smarts about me, I guess. I wanted to do a good job. I was ready to learn. I watched how the other boys did it, and I learned from them. But I was insecure, and I drank more up there. After 5 years, I looked around. Hey, I'm doing exactly what these other guys are doing. I'm just as good as they are. So I drank to celebrate a little bit, celebratory drinking. Later, hard drinking, defiant, arrogant, full of myself. But it came a time when I became fearful of myself. I was afraid of what was going to happen to me. I could see it happening. I was losing interest in my work, conflict in the family. Something had to be addressed. And it led me to leave Washington. You can call it burnout, whatever you want to. But I just had to try to start somewhere else again. And I came back and worked at the Avalanche Journal for 10 years, did columns, wrote editorials. It was good. Later, worked for KFYO. But I had sobered up during this period, especially when I worked for radio. I couldn't drink all night and go into a radio newscast because I was getting up at 3 in the morning to do my newscast, prepare for it. KFYO. They had a sister station in Victoria. I did that one too. I stayed sober several years at one point and then had what we call a relapse of several months when I went out of town. But I came back and straightened up. Now it's been many years, over 10 years now since I drank. Thank God for that, and everybody appreciates that. It's given me a whole new life, a whole new outlook on life, optimism, and it can be overcome. Of course, the alcoholic has to deal with it on a daily basis. We have to have a spiritual condition to give us some protection against the consequences of our drinking, resumed drinking. And so I'm sure many of you are aware of friends and relatives that have the problem, may have gone to rehab, may have gone to AA, all of which needs to be done if something is going to be going to resolve that drinking addiction or any other addiction. So there's some of my stuff that's in the book. If any of this intrigues you, whets your appetite, I'll tell you what I've told some people, go buy the book. Read it, and then take the damn thing out and burn it, because I don't know but what the statute of limitations are still alive on some of this stuff I did. On the other hand, thinking about my age, I don't think there's any statute of limitations alive that's going to bother me. I'm glad I'm here tonight. Thank you very much for having me.
Thank you, Bob. As you've just heard, there's hardly anything more powerful than the human voice relating a story in the first person. Nancy Draves and I talked about that a little bit before we got started this evening, about how that first source material, the first person, today's world we can record voices, but 100 years ago or even 50, 60 years ago, that was difficult. But Nancy, in 2008, found the 1861 diary of Kitty Anderson, who was the daughter of a prominent San Antonio resident and Union Army supporter, Colonel Charles Anderson, which must have been a tough job to have in San Antonio in those years. She found this in a public auction. Kitty's diary, acquired in 2009 by the Dolph Briscoe Center for American History, documents the Anderson family's experience during the early years of the Civil War. Draves has transcribed that diary in her first book, which is called A Promise Fulfilled, The Kitty Anderson Diary in Civil War Texas, 1861. Nothing better than that first person experience, that first source bit of history. Draves knows about that because she taught high school in San Antonio for 20 years, and she still lives there. I don't think still in the high school, right? Yeah, good. All right. Please welcome Nancy Draves.
Goodness. Thank you so much. I'm so excited about this. I want to start off, first of all, by saying thank you to the press. They were very patient with me. This was my first book, and so they would quickly return all emails and phone calls, and I really appreciate the help that they gave me in this process. I also want to thank Joanna Conrad in particular for her sure hand. She saw early on a way in which to help me to format the diary so that there was a balance there between Kitty's words and then my words, my commentary on it. It's a very, very big story, and my time is limited here, but I talked to Joanna. Speaking of Joanna, I had talked to her about a week or two ago, and she said, would you like to speak? And I said, okay, I will do that. And then I said, well, what should I talk about? And she said, well, maybe start by talking a little bit about the diary itself, how that came about. So I'm going to start with that at Joanna's suggestion. In 2008, while I was actually working on another manuscript, Kitty Anderson's diary popped up on a public auction. And it was within the same time period that I was researching. Actually, San Antonio, my hometown, 1861. So I was very interested in it. And my husband, Tim, over there, he was good enough to correspond with the seller so that I was able to get a deeper insight into what the diary held. Here was a young woman, Kitty Anderson, who lived in San Antonio at the outbreak of the Civil War. Her family was Unionist. They were forced to sell their home, ranch, and then later held under house arrest at the Minger Hotel. Okay, so you heard that right? The Minger Hotel. Okay, so I'm reading this and I'm like, oh my goodness, my great-great-grandparents built that hotel. William and Mary Minger built that hotel in 1859. So you can bet my interest in that diary was piqued. We didn't buy the diary, so I'll say that right now. We did not purchase it. The dollar sign kind of went up there. But fortunately, it was acquired by the Dolph Briscoe Center in Austin, and I was able to access it in about 2009. The first time I read it, how do I explain this? I know I did not take a breath. Her handwriting was impeccable, so beautiful. It was easy to read for the most part. And I would catch myself reading page after page, and I literally had not taken a breath. And I know we have all had that experience at one point in time. Maybe you're waiting for a movie to come out, and you're so pumped up about it. You get in there, and it starts, and you're like, gosh, I didn't take a breath here. Or you've got this famous artist, you love art, you get the chance to see that painting, that Matisse painting, the dance, and there you are right in front of it, and you're so caught up in the emotion of it. That was my experience with Kitty's diary. So I'm going to share a little bit about the family with you so that you have a little bit of a background there. Kitty Anderson and her family, they were from Ohio, Dayton, Ohio, as a matter of fact. Her father, Charles Anderson, was a Ohio senator, was also a lawyer. The family had a very nice life in Ohio. They were prominent people, but he was sick a lot of the time. He suffered from some upper respiratory problems, and the Ohio climate was not really conducive to his health. So it had gotten to such a point that the family started looking to alternatives, another place to live. And so they decided on San Antonio, Texas. And San Antonio at that time was being touted as a health resort. And people would literally go there for the dry, clean air. And we're recovering, okay? So he saw this, and I'm sure the family gathered and talked over the move. But I want to tell you something about Charles Anderson here. Charles Anderson had always wanted a ranch. So there's a little bit there where you're thinking, okay, yeah, he's sick, but he wants to go to Texas. He wants to have that ranch. He wants to raise cattle and stock, and in his case, thoroughbred horses. That he wanted to bring in some Kentucky thoroughbred horses. And so the family made the move. This would have been Kitty and her mother and her younger sister, Belle, who was about 10 years younger than her. And they had a brother, and he was at West Point at that particular time. So it was just the four of them that moved down into San Antonio. They were readily accepted and welcomed by San Antonians. They were happy that they were putting in this ranch and they were bringing in this stock. The United States Army was there. They had their headquarters. It was a hub of the Army there in Texas. And so it was just the most wonderful, ideal situation. Kitty became engaged over the time that she was there to Captain William G. Jones. So for the most part, things were going pretty well until 1860. After the election of Abraham Lincoln, Charles Anderson was going to ride the 4 miles into town, and he was stopped by some friends, fellow Unionists, who said, "Now, Charles, you told us that if the state were to ever move towards secession, that you would speak." They knew he was a good orator. They knew that from his history in the Ohio Senate. And so he begged off because he had wanted to get away from politics and, just didn't want to be brought into this situation. But they said, "No, you promised, and that's a promise you have to keep." And so he did. And in San Antonio, there were, this is true in many cities and towns, there were a lot of public rallies where people would come together and there would be speakers that would speak on different issues, maybe of the town or the state. And there would be voice votes and such. And so on this particular occasion, it was organized by some of the secessionist groups in town. And so there was a call for another speaker, and these Unionist friends kind of pushed Charles Anderson up to the front, and he got up on the platform, no notes, he had no prepared speech, and he just poured his heart out in favor of the Union. He said, "What I see happening now is treason. I see it as treacherous. The Union, this banner of glory." He was very, very patriotic and very emotional in his speech. And after that speech, their lives changed, okay, over the course of the next year. I think he referred to it, or Kitty refers to it, as like there was like a gray storm coming in. Friends feared for his life. There were people that were being killed because of their sentiments. And it's about a 4-mile ride from their home to the downtown part of San Antonio. They lived in what we know of as the Alamo Heights area. In fact, Charles Anderson bought pretty much all of that Alamo Heights area. So he would ride in, and his friends would form like a protective circle around him, so fearful that he would be grabbed and hanged. When Kitty begins her diary, I have a copy of the cover of the book. When Kitty begins her diary, September 29th, 1861, it's at the forced sale of their home. And it's a very melancholy type situation. It's during the evening, like we see here. They're in their home. There's a single candle lit on a table, and Kitty talks about witnessing her mother and her father sign away their home. She calls it the most beautiful home ever. And so she closes out there. Her fiance is there too. The next morning, they come together and they leave to go out of town. They're going to leave the state, go to Mexico. And they are only out of town about a day when they are surrounded by Confederate forces. And so they're circled around and they stop. And Charles Anderson is quite indignant, refers to it as a rascally affair. And the Confederates are a little bit apologetic, Kitty says, and says, they say, well, sir, you need to go back into town on orders of Henry McCullough, and you can take your time if you want to. And Charles Anderson says, no, we're going right now. We're going to go back into town. And so they travel all day, and they get to the Minger Hotel. And they are then placed under house arrest on the second floor of the Minger Hotel. They have adjoining rooms. They're given 2 rooms, and also there's a guard posted outside of their rooms. Kitty talks about the long, weary hours of sitting and waiting to see what her father has been accused of in particular, to see what their eventual fate will be. They receive some guests, but all guests are sort of scrutinized. Thankfully, she is able to see her fiance, who comes in and tries to cheer them up. And she writes of trying to stay cheerful. That's what I really appreciate her. As you read this diary, you will know where she feels this, maybe she is the oldest daughter. She feels this responsibility to her parents, to her father, maybe to her younger sister. She is so complimentary of her father, of his bravery, of his nobleness. There was so much respect that she showed him that it's really quite moving. Unfortunately for them, Charles Anderson is never granted an audience with Henry McCullough. Their luggage is checked several times. Their trunks are looked through. All of Charles Anderson's papers were taken from him. And then there was the threat of taking all of their funds, all of their money. As a matter of fact, Kitty and her mother both discuss, Kitty's writing this, how they are going to hide the money on their person, so that they would have some money in order to leave. Henry McCullough says that he does not want to speak with Charles Anderson. He will not grant him that time. He does not want his, quote, sympathies aroused. And so they get to a point where it's like a stalemate. I mean, we're not going anywhere. We're just here at the hotel. And so Charles Anderson comes to his family and he says, it's time for you to leave. It's time for you to go ahead and leave without me. And so Kitty and her mother and her younger sister, who Kitty at this time is about 20 years old and her sister's about 10, they are escorted into a carriage, actually by Kitty's fiance, who again tries to remain very cheerful and packing all the luggage. And mother is crying, and Belle, the little sister, she's crying, sobbing. And Kitty writes that she sat like a stone as they pulled away from the town. In the meantime, in the diary, Kitty adds a 10 to 12 page addendum in which she writes about her father's escape from Texas. And so I want to add that here now because unbeknownst to the women, a few unionists in town had kind of developed a plan or a plot, a way to try to help him get out of the city. He was held on the Salado Creek. If you're familiar with San Antonio, you probably heard of the Salado Creek. He was held in a prison camp there on the Salado Creek. And these people put together a very elaborate plan to try to help him escape, and he has guards everywhere. So the story of his escape is quite amazing. In the meantime, Kitty Anderson and her mother and sister, when they go south, she is so good about detailing all the individuals that they meet, the places they stay. They stayed at Captain King's ranch. She notices how congenial the Kings were to them, treating them with much kindness, supplying them with plenty of beef for the rest of their journey. She also talks about seeing the Confederate arms being stored there. And I will say something about those Confederate arms. The first time I read the diary, I missed it. I missed that. And so another time when I went back in, I saw where she had written it like a little arrow and, noted the Confederate arms being stored there. Their escort down south was Jose Agustin Quintero, who was a fascinating character. He was President Jefferson Davis's Confederate agent in Texas. So this was the lady's, escort down south. So this person along the way, you get the feeling that he's doing business as they're leaving the town, but they are being observed too. And I'm sure he had the job of kind of keeping track of what the ladies are doing. There are two personal pieces of art that I have included in my work here, and I will speak briefly about one of them. There was an individual that helped Charles Anderson to escape San Antonio. He was a Belgian astronomer that got caught up in the war and was having trouble getting out of San Antonio and out of the state. And his name was Jean Husseau. And one summer, my husband and I, we were down at the coast, and there was a lot of rain. And I was real caught up in this Husseau's life because I'd done some research, some background on him. And I started thinking about how incredibly brave he was and some of the other individuals in town in trying to secure the safety of Charles Anderson, for ultimately that bravery, that courage enabled that family to eventually come back together again. So I was so taken with Husseau that I sketched his picture. So you will see a picture of Husseau in there, and it's just my quick little, all caught up in the moment kind of a thing here. So it's a very powerful story. She's an amazing writer. She was very compelling. Working with her was, if you enjoy music, think of a musical score, okay? And I felt like I was the backup singer for somebody like maybe Beyonce or Barbara Streisand. It's like, okay, Nancy, you cannot overpower this voice. I mean, this voice is too good. All you can do is kind of try to harmonize with her, or kind of try to keep up the energy here, because tonight, it's really about Kitty Anderson, and I'm just so happy that the press saw the value in it, and that after 150 years, her story will be told. Thank you.
Thank you, Nancy. Not wanting to make light of being incarcerated, I will have to say that if ever I am, I dearly hope it's in the Minger Hotel. What a wonderful place. And what a great relation of a first source piece of material in this diary. Our next and the last author of this evening has written an extraordinary book based on his interviews with people in a culture that gets way too little attention, but has produced so much for us in the language that we speak, the names of the places in which we inhabit, the food that we eat, the music that we love. And that is the music, all that comes from what we would call, at least when I was coming of age, we called the Chicano culture. In the 1960s, as a teenager, Ruben Molina used to take a bus down to Hollywood and shop for records. He developed a passion for vinyl that has never waned, and aren't we glad, Ruben, that that passion is coming back into style, vinyl. He's a community historian. He interviewed dozens and dozens of artists whose music he loved, and that work that he first began, all of the recognition for that whole genre of music can be traced back to his efforts. His book, Chicano Soul, Recordings and History of an American Culture, it's the first ever history of Mexican-American soul and R&B, and now we've released it in its 10th anniversary edition. Ruben lives in La Puente, California. Please welcome.
Imagine a time when there wasn't any computers, no social media, the phone wasn't what it is, and television had 4 channels. The entertainment center was the record player, and that's was my life, growing up. That's how I grew up. My mother was very young when I was 9, 10 years old. She was in her early 20s. So music was like everything to her, and she loved Ray Charles and Sam Cooke and all of the great R&B singers of the time, plus the Mexican singers from Mexico. So our house was really full of music from both Mexico and from the rock and roll scene. That kind of bled right over to me. I took up collecting records really young and never stopped. I think I bought about 4 records since we've been here on eBay, right? So for us, it was just a part of life. It wasn't. We didn't think about it as a historical project or anything. I mean, you loved a certain recording. You went out and bought it for 25 cents, brought it home, put it on the record player, and that was the extent of it. And every week, new songs would come out. It moves on to the Motown era, which for me, I was a kid when Motown and junior high school. So it was a really important part of my life. At the same time, across the Southwest, kids were picking up guitars, playing drums. I mean, the high schools, junior high schools had orchestras. People learned how to play horn, saxophone, trumpets. So kids could get together with just what they learned in high school, what they learned from the recordings that they heard, and make combos, make bands. And at the same time, you had kids that were following in the family business out here in Texas with the conjuntos. A conjunto is a requinto, a bajo sexto, and an accordion. Right there you have the family business, so to say. But at the same time, because there were a lot of these conjuntos started when kids were 11, 12, 13 years old. But as they got older and 15 years old, 16 years old, and rock and roll is ruling the airwaves, so they're listening to Chuck Berry and Fats Domino. They're influenced by New Orleans, by Chicago, by Detroit, but so they're bringing all of this, what they know that they have already learned, and then what they're listening to on the radio, and they put this together. At the same time, there's independent record companies. A small businessman might have an insurance company in the front office and then a recording studio in the back. There's records that we have that were recorded that recorded right adjacent to railroad tracks, and you can hear a train going by as they're recording. It's just all of these just kind of makeshift studios to be able to record all of these young groups, and very small pressing. So if there was groups in Corpus Christi, there was Brownsville, San Antonio, Houston, all over, and they were doing rock and roll in English and in Spanish. So you had, if you listen to like Freddie Fender, he did a lot of his recordings. He did both in English and in Spanish, and he would use different names. Under the Spanish recordings would be Baltimore Huerta, his birth name. English recordings as Freddie Fender. So all of this was kind of going on at the same time. So how do I get into it? So about 12 years ago, I came across a record. And now, mind you, I didn't really know about all of these things. Not as much as I know now, but I came across a recording by a guy named Dimas. And it was just such a beautiful song. And I did some quick research on it and found out he was from San Antonio. So I said, okay, I'm going to take a trip to San Antonio and I'm going to find this guy just to tell him how great this song is. So I come out to San Antonio. I'm looking for him. I'm asking around the streets, and I get nothing. So I go back to the airport, and I get a phone call. You out here looking for Dimas? Yes. Okay, come back, he's here. And I said, well, I can't. I'm at the airport. I got to go to work tomorrow. Well, come back next week. I mean, like as if it's a drive. So I get home. My wife's already like, what are you doing? So I get home, and then she says, how'd it go? Well, pretty good. I'm going to go back Friday. You're going to do what? I go back Friday, and they invite me over to a barbecue, and it's this, like, whole group of singers. Dimas Garza is there. The Royal Jesters are there. I can just go on with names because that probably you wouldn't recognize, but to me, like the greatest singers come out of San Antonio. So they're all there, and I took with me a scanner and a recorder, and I start interview them, scanning their pictures, and I said, "Well, this is what I'm going to do." So for the next 2 years, I did the same thing. I went back to San Antonio maybe 3 or 4 times. I went to Houston, Dallas, Austin, El Paso, Phoenix, Albuquerque, everywhere I could find these groups, and I think you'll see at the end of the book, discography is pretty deep. Came up, turned up hundreds of recordings, and once the book came out, fellow record collectors were like really upset because the value of those records just went up because everybody was like, "Whoa, wow, I want to get this." And so the value of those recordings went up, but it was important to do it because it's almost like the last corner of rock and roll that hasn't been touched. And I was invited to speak at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and it was the anniversary, 50-year anniversary of the death of Buddy Holly, Ritchie Valens, and the Big Bopper. So they wanted me to do a presentation on Ritchie Valens. And I said, no, I won't do that. I want to do a presentation on what happened after Ritchie Valens. Because he was 1958, more or less the beginning of this. But at the same time that Ritchie Valens was recording, so was Freddie Fender, so was Mondo and the Chili Peppers, all of these Chicano groups in 1958 that were around. So I wanted to tell basically the world, hey, it didn't end right there. And so, anyways, I do my presentation. At the same time, I'm playing records like the kind you've been listening to before the dinner. And this woman comes down, and she says, my husband's the CEO of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and he refuses to come down and talk to you. He is so mad because he thinks he owns every record ever made, rock and roll record, and the things you're playing have never been, he's never heard them. And I was like, that's what I was trying to get across. So, you know, there's a lot of stories. Because I'm really not a writer type writer like the writers. So what I try to do is put it in their own words. From the recordings, I just try to put it in, because there's so many stories. There's so many stories that come out of California, that come out of Phoenix. In Phoenix, I had, the groups that I was writing on. Well, some of them were mixed between the Chicano kids and Apache kids. So, like, once a month, I would get guys drive down to LA from Phoenix and take a box of books back to the reservation, the Apache reservation there. And what was I going to say? I lost my place there. But anyways, there's plenty of stories of how they moved around. I mean, the groups from San Antonio were so popular going up through Tennessee, Kentucky, up to play in Chicago. And then what they did was they followed the farm workers. So in following the farm workers up to all the way up to Washington, because they would go up through Wisconsin and then across to Washington. So they had to learn how to play music in Spanish. They had to learn all the songs in Spanish so that they can do the work in the fields, do these dances that were in the ranches and stuff that they worked at. And then they had to learn the English to play in the big cities like Chicago and Milwaukee, some of the other cities there. So they were very diverse musicians. And it came about by the 70s, because this period lasts about 10, maybe 12 years. But then, like during the 70s, it evolves into Tex-Mex, which is basically done in Spanish. But it's kind of the same musicians. They were just kids doing soul music, doing rhythm and blues. They grow up and evolve and become the Tex-Mex sound. So you some of these singers that you see that are just singing in Spanish and are very popular in the Tex-Mex sound were also soul singers as kids. So it was a lot of fun to do. It was, by the way, Dimas Garza, my inspiration for the book. When I met him, and he was a carpet layer, so humble, so quiet, and he, gave me his story, and I was so taken by his story that I took him to Los Angeles to perform, and he was just like thrilled because he had never left San Antonio, and so popular. I mean, at this now, because of the book and because of the internet, because of record collectors around the world, people know him in Germany, in England, in Spain. Their recordings are so cherished around the world. Japan, I'm just like, when people tell me, I just came back from Spain and Portugal, and they just are so in love with that sound. But anyway, so I took him to LA. We brought him back, and we started working on some things. He had a heart attack and passed away. And that's the importance of these stories, of recording these really great artists, in any field, but musicians, artists, whatever, getting that oral history and putting it down for everyone to read, and to, for a lot of young kids right now in San Antonio that are following the book, following or collecting these records, they're inspired because it's like their culture. They're like, hey, this is our culture. We didn't even know it existed because it had been kind of brushed under the rug for nearly 50 years. So anyways, I'm so grateful for the university for helping, taking on this project, inviting me here, and I hope you all enjoy it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Ruben. Like food, music doesn't know ethnicity or boundaries or race or language. And it always strikes me when I get to listen to someone like Ruben, I think about if we could just eat and sing and dance, we wouldn't have any problems, Thank you, Ruben. Wonderful work. It also reminds us, Ruben and Nancy, they remind us of the importance of the community historians, the people who are there with those original sources and save them before they disappear forever. We can't thank them enough. So that's worth a round of applause, don't you think? Speaking of Nancy, you've got these on your table. There are more in the back. Since we had that unfortunate problem with getting the book here on time, please take one of these, fill it out, and make sure you get that book. We appreciate you coming out tonight. Don't forget, we're going to do this again next year, pretty much the same time, same place. Don't forget that tomorrow, the Lubbock Book Festival is going on all day at the Louise Hopkins Underwood Center for the Arts on the campus. It's scattered across there. You can find the full schedule on the web. Now for our silent auction winners. Ruben, we should have brought somebody with some congas or something to give us a little drum roll. Item number 1, which is Builders of the Southwest by multiple authors. These are by people by Marshall Formby, and Fort Concho and the Texas Frontier by J. Evans Haley. This is like the grand prize. All these great books. Was won by Janine Patterson. So, now, All of you winners, see Joanna Conrad. Joanna, stand up. She will take you back and take your money and give you your prize. Item number 2, I love this. The flamboyant judge, James D. Hamlin, was won by Randall and Kyla Osborne. So another round of applause. And now I don't know about this. This is an evening with Janet Neugebauer. I love it. I've spent a lot of days with Janet, and I've enjoyed every one of them. But this is going to involve a dinner and a lot of really great stuff. It's going to be at Dean Gerlich's home. The winners of that are Alan and Sandy Henry. So, thank you. Okay, now, if you've not done so, tonight you can join the Texas Tech Friends of the Library. And if you're a beginning member, you get an additional 5% off the books that you're about to buy over in our book sales area. It's an already generous discount. It supports Literary Lubbock, this event, and the Grover E. Murray Studies in the American Southwest. Buy a sack load. You don't have to read them all. You can give them away as gifts. Christmas is around the corner. You know lots of people that need a gift. What better than a book? Then I'd like for you to stick around. These authors are going to be here for the balance of the evening. Visit with them, get their signatures, and please remember to thank our sponsors, the Friends of the Library, Texas Tech University Press, Dean Gerlich, and all our staff here for putting on this wonderful event. Thank you and good night.